Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my Endless Diary Tales channel? Thank you so much. So get this, I got reborn and the first thing I did was finally decide to let go of Sarah. Seriously, she was this amazing actress destined for the spotlight and I was holding her back. I knew she was into the props guy Mark, so I straight up suggested we call off our engagement. See, in my previous life I trapped her with this marriage contract binding her for life until she died. She never got to be open with Mark, the guy she actually loved. The worst part? It was only when I was lonely and old in a nursing home that I realized I had been trapped for a lifetime too. The first thing after waking up in my old body was submitting this application that had been sitting on my computer forever. The moment I saw the acceptance letter, I felt like I was dreaming. My professor who'd been mentoring me was super happy. He was like, "I always told you to go for that PhD abroad. You kept saying you couldn't because your fiancé was working in North City, but look at you now." Talking about Sarah, she was seriously something else. She came from money, was already successful in her career at like 25, and was kind of famous in the theater world. Her career was just taking off. Me? I had good grades and that was about it. If it weren't for this agreement our parents made when we were kids, Sarah and I would have never even crossed paths. My eyes were all determined and I told my professor, "This time I'm going to try doing things my way." He patted me on the back and said, "Getting a PhD is a long, lonely road. You got to be mentally prepared." Long? Yeah, but not as long as my last life. In that life, I gave up that PhD opportunity. The Miller family was pushing us to get married, and just a month after the wedding, she got pregnant. She didn't want the baby, said it would mess up her acting career. But I was so desperate for a family that I took on everything at home. Seriously, everything. From then on, I was trapped in this endless cycle of chores and errands. Meanwhile, Sarah felt like her duty was done and was barely ever home. She was always busy with performances and rehearsals. Her fame was growing, and she was constantly traveling for work. But wherever she went, Mark was always there, right by her side as the props master. Besides work, he took care of her every need. Me? I was stuck with the Miller family, raising our kid, taking care of the elderly. Our son Alex grew up in what was basically a single-parent household, and I always thought he was super attached to me until I saw him getting engaged to Mark's niece. At the engagement party in the private room, he was acting all affectionate with Mark, no holding back. He picked up his teacup and smiling this huge smile said, "Dad, would you like some tea?" A month later, he confessed to me, his tone totally indifferent. He said, "Dad, Mom is a career woman. You, as a stay-at-home father, have already bound her for a lifetime. That's enough." He continued, "Men who reach your level are really pathetic. Mom has already given you face. You can't be." I felt that only Sarah was bound by the marriage contract. I deserved to be a victim of family life, but why? When we were young, I asked for her consent, and she agreed to the arranged marriage. Because of that, I gave up my career, my dreams. She worked hard on her career while I tirelessly took care of the elderly. She was busy with performances, and I had to manage 3 meals a day for the whole family. At the toughest times, I was holding my son in one hand and a medical appointment slip in the other. I was running around alone, arranging doctor visits, buying medicine, paying bills. By the time I was 50, Sarah's career was skyrocketing. She was super successful. Meanwhile, my social circle was shrinking, and life had me totally trapped. At that point, everyone said I wasn't good enough for her. Everyone advised me to let go, and even my son, whom I raised single-handedly, felt that Mark should be the one by her side. But I refused. In my last encounter with my son, we had this huge fight. He left me standing on the street, and as I slowly collapsed watching him walk away, I felt this immense regret. If I could do it all over again, I would absolutely never give up my own life. So back to the present. After getting back to the apartment, I put away the acceptance letter and headed to the kitchen to bake some egg tarts. This apartment belonged to the Miller family to make it easier for me to study. Sarah and I were living here together. On the calendar in the living room, I drew this big red circle. In half a month, I could leave this place and live the life I'd always wanted. Just after I finished drawing, Sarah came back. When the door opened, there were 2 figures behind her. A taller one and a smaller one, Mark and his niece Lily. Seeing me open the door, Mark gave this seemingly cheerful smile. "David," Sarah asked me to come up and sit for a bit, adding another bit of trouble for you." The little girl was eager, sensing the sweet smell in the air. She ran into the kitchen and grabbed desserts from the tray herself, 6 egg tarts, 2 each. They happily split them, but there were none for me. When I came out of the kitchen, the 3 of them were huddled together, chatting and laughing. After taking a bite of an egg tart, all 3 of them simultaneously spat it out. "Uncle, it's so bitter." I just stood there while Sarah busily moved around. One moment she was pouring water, the next she was passing tea. Finally, Mark forced a smile and left. The dimples that usually appeared on his cheeks were gone, but his words remained forgiving and generous. "Sarah, David's cooking still has room for improvement. You two mustn't argue." Sarah silently saw them out. When she came back, I turned around and brought out another tray of egg tarts. Sarah hesitated before explaining, "Lily is my sister's orphan. Before she died, she repeatedly urged me to take good care of Mark. I let the child taste your delicious desserts." I still remained silent. She dry-added, "If you mind so much, I will call them less often in the future." The next day, early in the morning, I went to pack my luggage, getting ready to go to City C in a couple of days. Since I decided to call off the engagement, I needed to be clear about it early on, out of respect and to avoid any future drama. While packing, I saw a mud doll. It was the one Sarah gave me when I was a kid. Back then, she was so firm, her chubby hands covered in mud. "David," Mom said, "you'll be my husband when you grow up, so this is for you." The doll ended up in my suitcase. I no longer needed her. I got up and drew a big cross on the calendar in the living room. 14 days left and I would leave this place. That night, Sarah came back very late. She looked at the food on the table like nothing was wrong. I ate before coming back. A woman who steals food doesn't even know to wipe her mouth. After last time, she knew that bringing Mark back would make me angry, so she simply ate outside. Luckily, I didn't cook her a meal either. After dinner, back in the room, I started organizing documents, making final preparations before school. Sarah silently appeared behind me. I closed the laptop with my hand. "What's wrong?" She was silent for a moment before saying, "The wedding planners and hotel people have contacted me. Can we set the date on September 1st? What a great date choice, coinciding with my first day of school. I looked up directly at Sarah, and 3 seconds later, she silently avoided my gaze. In my previous life, she handled everything between us like it was a business deal. Dating, marriage, having kids, supporting the family. From an outsider's perspective, she did everything perfectly, but only I could feel her aloofness, her coldness. It wasn't until before her death that I realized, belatedly, that she was probably dissatisfied with this marriage from the beginning. But in the end, only I withered away in this marriage. So I asked her, "Sarah, have you decided?" She was stunned, not expecting me to ask like this. Then I heard the exact same answer as in my last life. She said, "David, you are the only husband I acknowledge." This time I didn't hesitate. I said, "Marriage is a big deal, we need to discuss it with our parents. The date isn't urgent. Let's wait a bit longer." She looked relieved and smiled, changing the topic. "Still reading English literature so late? Don't get too tired." That was my enrollment assignment. In this life, I wanted to choose the path I didn't choose before. I wanted to see how exciting David could be without Sarah. On the 3rd day, Sarah woke up early. When I got up, there was a bowl of crab ar buns from Nanchang on the table. They were my favorite. It was rare for her to try to please me, so I patiently waited to see what she wanted. Sure enough, Sarah hesitated before speaking. "David, I can't accompany you to your parents' house this time. Lily is sick, and Mark can't manage on his own." Only then did I start eating. I hadn't even figured out an excuse to prevent her from coming with me now. It was perfect, a win-win for both of us. Seeing me nod in agreement, Sarah hurriedly left the house. I glanced at the calendar on the wall. There were 13 days left. Today was the day to call off the engagement. The Miller parents were kind to me, but breaking off the engagement wasn't difficult. I just needed to tell them that Sarah had a bright future and was about to soar to great heights. As for her and me, we were no longer compatible. The living room of the Miller household was silent and heavy. I sat aside, silently twirling the teacup in my hand. Mrs. Miller opened her mouth several times, only to swallow her words back. Over the past few years, I had heard quite a bit about Mark. After holding back her words for a long time, she finally said, "Even if she has feelings for Mark, You two are still engaged. If she dares to back out, I'll deal with her. Mr. Miller was the final authority. Since you've decided to call off the engagement, we respect your decision. But David, the relationship between our two families won't change. We still consider you our closest junior. Sarah was now the apple of everyone's eye, so even her biological parents couldn't understand why I insisted on calling off the engagement. But I understood that regarding this arranged marriage, they probably had some hidden expectations. Now that I took the initiative to end it, it was somewhat considerate. This was good for my future life regarding Sarah and the Miller family. I no longer wanted any entanglements. After all, in the end they were still family. Engagement terminated. To prevent any complications, I lied to them, saying that Sarah was too busy and that she had asked me to return alone. After hearing this, Mrs. Miller felt a bit guilty towards me. She advised me to stay at their house for a while before leaving. Coincidentally, I didn't want to go back to that small apartment and live in constant proximity with Sarah day and night. I stayed at the Miller household for 10 days. During these 10 days, Sarah only made one phone call. After learning that I was staying with the Millers, she never called again. She was still the same as before. Regarding our relationship, she maintained a businesslike demeanor. No concern, no loss of composure. Upon returning, the first thing I did was mark 10 big red crosses on the calendar. 4 days left. Only 4 days remained. I was carrying my luggage back home when I heard the door open. Sarah stood outside the door, followed closely by Mark and Lily. "You're back." Sarah looked a bit surprised when she saw me. Mark and Lily actually turned and entered my room. I frowned as I saw him naturally close the door to my room. The living room was a mess. Upon closer inspection, it was filled with my belongings. I looked at Sarah. A hint of embarrassment flashed across her face. Mark's house had a leak due to heavy rain a couple of days ago, so he's staying here temporarily. For 2 days I saw you weren't home and you didn't have much stuff, so I let him stay. In your room for now. I hadn't even told her about calling off the engagement yet. The two of them were truly shameless, facing my piercing gaze. Sarah generously said, "You can move into my room first and sleep in my bedroom temporarily." As Sarah spoke, she opened the door to her room. "Oh, by the way, where are the books from your room? Why are there so few things?" "Of course they were moved out. I sold them. I thought I wouldn't need them after marriage," I explained lightly. Sarah frowned. "Even after marriage, you might still need them. Self-improvement is important at any time. Anyway, if you want to sell them, go ahead." She knew everything from the start, but she didn't care. She watched me being consumed by that family. As a beneficiary of their interests, Sarah was content and at ease, but she couldn't and shouldn't be. While enjoying my efforts, she was also distracted by Mark. I pressed my lips together and remained silent. Seeing my continued silence, she finally said, "By the way, what did your parents say?" Sarah took the bag from my hand as well. I paused. I did some calculations. "The timing isn't right, we can talk about it later." There were still 4 days left. I used this excuse to buy some time. When I left, I would explain everything clearly to her. Sarah sighed with relief, then put on a concealed smile. She looked at the calendar in the living room. "Looks like we need to find another good date again." After saying that, she rushed to the kitchen to cook. She didn't even notice what I had marked on the calendar. I looked at Sarah's household registration book on the desk by the window. When I came to my senses and wanted to help, I heard the faint voices of 3 people outside. A man with a deep voice, a charming woman, and an adorable child. I silently sat down again. In reality, having already called off the engagement, living together was inappropriate, especially sharing the same room. But with only 4 days left, I couldn't find a suitable rental outside. After thinking it over, it seemed I could only eat a meal, and then set up a temporary sleeping arrangement in the living room. Before bed, early the next morning, still half asleep, Lily was causing a loud commotion in the living room. Mark not only ignored it but was also making clanging noises in the kitchen. Sarah simply sat on the sofa, smiling as she watched the two of them. Perhaps this was the image of a happy family she had in her mind. I used the excuse of buying groceries and hurriedly left the house. As soon as I stepped outside, I took a deep breath. Why did David come back? Didn't you say you were going to visit your in-laws? My neighbor Susan saw me leave and approached me. Her words were filled with good-natured teasing. Not your in-laws? Susan was taken aback for a moment, then laughed, thinking I was indulging Sarah's reputation. Yes, still not your in-laws. We always have to wait until we're married to change that. She noticed my expression had lost its usual smile. Susan hesitated, then couldn't hold back any longer. She began to reprimand me in a low voice. These past 2 days when you weren't around, Sarah brought men home. I asked her once and she actually said it was with your permission. That man looks restless. Did you really nod to that? The wedding isn't even done yet. Silly child. Be more careful with Sarah's qualifications. If she hadn't been engaged to you, I guarantee I would have introduced my nephew to her. Who wouldn't be attracted? Men are flocking one after another. You need to be sharp. Even if men were approaching one after another, only Mark stood by Sarah's side. She didn't need to worry because Sarah would always back him up. What I didn't expect was that Sarah outwardly claimed it was my decision. She was careful not to let any taint touch Mark. She had indeed put in a lot of effort, but some things I still couldn't speak about. Now, Susan saw that I was soft-hearted, pouted, and finally kept advising me to be more cautious at home. When I returned, the living room was empty. However, I could hear rustling sounds coming from my basement. After a while, Lily bounced up to the room. She was holding a tattered piece of drawing paper. I squinted to see it was a portrait I drew of Sarah last New Year's Day. The woman in the painting still had cold eyes, but her mouth held a faint smile. The room was warm like spring, and fireworks illuminated the outside. During those few hours, Sarah's eyes were only for me. I always thought that after marriage, we would spend many days and nights repeating such simple happiness, but I never expected that it was her only time to look at me seriously. The drawing in Lily's hand was already torn and tattered. There were sticky sugar stains on the paper behind her. Mark had followed up. Kids don't understand, David. You won't hold it against the child, will you? His tone was gentle, but the pride and contempt in the corners of his eyes were clear as day. Since you know they don't understand, educate them more. It seemed he didn't expect me to retort, and Mark was momentarily stunned. Kids understand the atmosphere the best, I said. Lily suddenly rushed forward. Her dirty little hand slapped mine, leaving a black handprint on my shirt. You can't bully my uncle. The little girl's voice was sharp and piercing. Sarah rushed in from outside the door. She grabbed Lily and pulled her into her arms. I didn't look at her. My gaze shifted to the fallen drawing paper. Sarah followed my line of sight and was momentarily stunned. She clearly understood something. She wanted to say something but swallowed her words back. Mark looked even more pleased, his face showing a facade of grievance. Sarah, I'm sorry. It's all my fault for not keeping a better eye on Lily. At that moment, my laughter erupted abruptly. All 3 pairs of eyes turned to look at me at the same time. I picked up the drawing, held it up to the light and said, I didn't draw it right. The lighting in the house wasn't this bright. After saying that, I threw the drawing into the trash can. I walked into the kitchen with a blank expression. Sarah suddenly looked up, staring blankly at my retreating figure, unable to attend to Lily's continued crying and fussing. Sarah followed me into the kitchen. She hesitated for a long moment before awkwardly opening her mouth. These past 2 days I've been busy looking for a place. In a couple of days, Mark will move out with Lily. I know you don't like him. Can you just bear with it a little longer? Without much thought, I replied, sure. After all, there were still 3 days left before I had to leave. It was originally the Miller family's house, and how they would manage their lives behind closed doors in this house wouldn't concern me anymore. I had agreed too quickly, and Sarah struggled to speak, her face turning pale and green, looking very uncomfortable. She thought I was angry about what just happened inside. Pulling me back, Lily is still a child. I've told you many times I take care of them, only because of my sister's request. Mark isn't easy either. Can't you stop thinking of people as so despicable? I sneered. So you brought him back and even told others it was my idea. Sarah's breath caught, and she opened her mouth but couldn't say a word. I laughed. See, no matter how eloquent her words were, the inner turmoil and sordid thoughts couldn't deceive anyone. Concerned about maintaining the elder's face, I didn't want to ruin her career, but it had to be this way. Early the next morning, I woke up early. Lily's loud commotion from yesterday had lingered in my mind. There must still be some of my things in the basement of the house. Taking advantage of the fact that they hadn't woken up yet, I went down to the basement to pack my things. Living in this house for several years, even with over a dozen days of preparation in advance, I still had many items left behind. I packed meticulously for the rest of my life. This lifetime. I no longer wanted to have any connection with Sarah. Since I had decided to leave, I wanted to leave completely. Finally, I organized everything into 3 large bags. As soon as I opened the door, I saw that Sarah had already prepared breakfast. Seeing the things I was holding, Sarah was stunned. "Where are you taking those things?" My tone was indifferent. "Throwing them away. There are too many useless items." Sarah glanced at them, and then looked away, turning to knock on the door of the room next door. "Mark, take Lily and get up. Breakfast is ready on the dining table." As soon as Lily saw me, she snorted and moved her breakfast closer to herself. "Mark," Sarah brought out a fried egg and smiled at me. "You're up. Come here, I made a fried egg for you." Turning her head to see the items in front of Lily and Mark, she awkwardly smiled. "Good girl, Lily. Can you share some with Uncle David?" I ignored the group and left the house directly. There were only a few days left before the semester started. All the necessary procedures had been prepared. I planned to exchange some petty foreign currency again. I wanted to see what else I needed to buy. Once everything was settled, I booked a room at a hotel. Although there were only 2 days left, seeing Sarah every day with my head down, and her looking up was really unsettling. Since she thought I was jealous of Mark, I decided to let her maintain that misunderstanding and use it as an excuse to move out. Once everything was in order, I returned home, but I saw Lily playing with my passport in her hands. My head buzzed. "What are you doing?" I snatched the passport back, startling Lily, who fell off the table. Her heart-wrenching cries drew Mark from another room. "What are you doing? Who told you to bully Lily?" Mark pushed me away, tenderly picking up the child. I was trembling with anger, carefully placing the passport back into my bag. "Am I bullying her? Don't you see what she did? Who told you to touch my things? Get out." Mark stood up, holding the child, looking coldly at me. "Haha, you haven't even married Sarah yet. This isn't your place to decide." He walked to the door with the child in his arms, paused for a moment, then turned back. "Even if you did get married, you couldn't compete with me." With a loud bang, the door was closed. Mark's hostility towards me always surfaced when Sarah wasn't around. In the past, I always kept retreating when facing him. He traveled extensively, gradually becoming capable on his own. Everyone said they were the perfect partners. In comparison, I was just a stay-at-home father, much inferior. But with a second chance at life, I felt suddenly relieved. He might be excellent, but I had my own strengths. Why should Mark and I be placed on opposite ends of the scale because of Sarah, who wasn't worth it? Besides Sarah, did I have nothing else in life? I could continue my studies, contributing to the relentless pursuit of medical excellence for humanity. I could go out, broaden my horizons, and gain more knowledge. This quagmire here would only hinder my progress. As for Mark, when I first returned, I had considered taking revenge on him. In my past life, he made my marriage nominally exist. I thought about causing trouble at their theater or exposing him online. But what good would it do? As long as Sarah wanted, she had 100 ways to continue taking care of Mark. Moreover, if Sarah wasn't interested, even if Mark stood before her naked, she wouldn't give him a glance. Why bother? It was just a misguided love. I didn't want to waste my life dealing with it anymore. So I spoke firmly to Mark. "Listen, no matter what your relationship with Sarah is, whether you admit it or not, it has nothing to do with me anymore. I'm not going to marry her. If you understand what I'm saying, you should focus more on Sarah instead of provoking me. Otherwise, I might change my mind at any time." Mark was stunned. He waved his hand, trying to deny it, as if he was afraid of genuinely angering me. Finally, he reluctantly went back to his room. I packed my things and took one last look at the apartment. Looking around, there were traces of aces of other men who had lived here. Nothing to be attached to. I turned around and left back at the hotel. I quickly packed up and began composing a message to Sarah. Although she had treated me poorly in many ways in this lifetime up to this point, we didn't have any significant grievances in our past life. We had mutually hindered each other, ending up in an unclear state. If possible, I still wanted to clarify things in this lifetime. In the message, I didn't mention where I was going. I simply told her that I had decided to continue pursuing my PhD in medicine. Regarding our engagement, she didn't want to marry me, and I didn't want to marry her either, so we would just let it go. From now on, we would each find our own happiness. Before I could send the message, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Sarah standing outside. She looked out of breath, as if she had been running for a long time. "Why are you here?" she gasped, taking a few breaths. "I finally found you. I'm glad you're okay." I remained silent, thinking she was about to accuse me again. "All right, don't be angry. Come back with me," Sarah pleaded, trying to help me pack. I turned off my phone screen with my hands behind my back, but her gaze shifted and landed on my passport on the table. Sarah's expression changed drastically. "Where are you going?" I was taken aback, frustrated that I hadn't packed my things properly. In the afternoon, Lily was rummaging through my things. I was afraid she would damage them, so I took them out. Seeing my composed demeanor, Sarah sighed with relief. "I need to keep them safe so we can use them during our honeymoon," she said, handing me the passport and instructing me to place it in my clothes-to-body bag. I complied without hesitation, then pressed down on her hands as she tried to pack. Sarah frowned. "What are you still angry about? Lily was wrong, but she's still a child. Stop causing a scene. I just find it odd. Lily has always been well-behaved, but every time you come back, you end up clashing with her." Sarah wanted to say more, but seeing me look at her calmly, she suddenly stopped speaking. I only asked her one question. "Does Mark know you came to find me?" Sarah was somewhat annoyed. "What does that have to do with him? Why are you always clinging to Mark?" I ignored her and continued. "I guess he doesn't know. Otherwise, you wouldn't be standing here. I'm your fiancé. If we're fighting, it's natural for you to come find me. Then why subconsciously don't you want to tell him? Why do you always unconsciously avoid anything related to me in front of him? Every time we argue, you say it's because of your sister that you take such good care of him. You have several sisters. Why aren't the others as attentive as you?" "Sarah," I called her softly, "since you don't love me, just let me go." Sarah's expression changed drastically, and her body seemed to sway slightly. After a while, she struggled to say, "Since you're not going back, then reflect on yourself here. I'll come back to pick you up." Up in a few days, Sarah turned around and fled in a disheveled state. "I never intended to hurt you. I'm going back to prepare for the wedding." Listening to her stumbling footsteps fade away, I closed the door expressionlessly. It's so ridiculous in her eyes. Her willingness to prepare for the wedding to marry me was a great blessing. I should be deeply grateful. After Sarah left, I handled my check-in on my phone, and then went out to have dinner with a close friend from school. After graduation, everyone went their separate ways, and by the time I returned, some people might be hard to see again. At the table, my closest friend hesitated before speaking. He knew some things about me and Sarah. "James, didn't you say you'd get married after graduation? Why are you going abroad to further your studies again?" Long-distance relationships are a hurdle many couples can't overcome. I shook my head with a smile. "I'm not getting married." Then I raised my glass to youth, to friendship, to myself. So cheers to youth, friendship, and myself. After returning home, I took an early shower and went to bed. I expected to toss and turn all night, but instead, I had a good night's sleep and woke up at dawn. Upon waking, I headed straight to the airport. Before boarding the plane, I sent the message I had been editing for a long time to Sarah. After sending the message, my phone buzzed incessantly. I turned it off immediately. As the plane ascended, I felt a lightness in my body. In a daze, it was as if I saw my past self saying thank you. When the plane landed and I truly set foot on foreign soil, I suddenly felt like crying. In my past life, I could never take this step, but now it was so easy, as long as I wanted to. I composed myself and went to register at the school. In my previous life, I never had the chance to set foot on a university campus. This time, I cherished the opportunity dearly. Besides eating and sleeping, I spent my time either in class or in the library. During this period, besides being busy, I received 3 calls from Sarah. The first call was a month after the semester officially began. Sarah had gone through various means and finally obtained my number. When a stranger's number appeared on the screen, I had already guessed it was her. On the phone, Sarah was very emotional. She said she didn't agree to break off the engagement. She said that in her heart, I had always been her husband. Half a minute later, I hung up the phone. The second call was 2 months into the semester. In the midst of a heavy snowfall, Sarah's tired voice came through. She said she had arranged a house and a job for Mark, and had clearly told him that she wouldn't see him again. That day, I still listened quietly. Sarah's last call was on Christmas. In the midst of a heavy snowfall, I spoke for the first time. I said, "Sarah, the semester end exam results are out today. I got an A. At the beginning of the semester, I struggled with my studies, learning the language while attending classes, and rushing to the lab to keep up. With progress, the experiments weren't going well, facing endless failures. No one knew when I would achieve results." Sarah listened attentively on the other end, her breathing shallow. Finally, I said, "But you know what, Sarah? I'm very happy. I will never confine myself again." Sarah's voice suddenly choked, her tired voice echoed, "But I miss you." Her subject was still. She never cared about my emotional outlet, even in moments of reconciliation. After that call ended, I cried my heart out on the streets of the foreign city. No matter how hard I tried in my past life, I was hysterical, hateful, and regretful, but I never shed tears. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to cry. After wiping away my tears, I began to study even harder. In my second year of the PhD, I made a breakthrough in an experiment. Although the path from the experiment to clinical application was still long, only by persevering could thousands of patients benefit. Every late night, I would look up from the lab and see my peers still buried in their work, feeling an inexplicable drive supporting me. The feeling of fighting for an ideal was truly wonderful. Later, I heard from a classmate that Sarah had gotten married. Her partner was Mark. When my classmate explained, carefully considering my feelings, he said, "I heard Sarah had been preparing for a performance in the city where you're studying. After Mark found out, he went to cause trouble." I didn't hear the details, but the next day, the two of them were sleeping in the same bed. Sarah stubbornly refused to agree, but she got pregnant. I didn't respond. In this lifetime, she still entered marriage out of responsibility as a daughter, as a mother, but she never took on the responsibility of being a wife. At the end of the conversation, my classmate sighed. "When you went to school, I thought leaving Sarah was your loss. Now I realize men living their own lives truly shine. James, you're something we all admire." Now, 7 years later, I graduated with my PhD, returning to my homeland with a heap of research achievements. The rest of my life was filled with good times.